wildlife trade in the region from traffic. Many different hacks, though, when it comes to wildlife trade in the region. And so I'd like to invite you to kick it off for us. Because when we talk about wildlife trade, we're often thinking ivory and tigers. But wildlife trade is an incredibly heterogeneous phenomenon. Many different species, huge geography. And I'm hoping that you can give us a little bit of context about what exactly wildlife trade represents specifically in this region. And more generally, to help us set it up, to help us understand the status of things in Southeast Asia. We're hearing a lot more about wildlife trade than we did several years ago. And I'm wondering, has something changed? Or is this just the same thing all over again?
Thank you, Jacob. Good morning, everyone. I've lived in this region and worked in illegal wildlife trade for close to 25 years, working with traffic for 20 years. And I can clearly say that the situation now is worse than it's ever been. We've seen a real decline over time of the number of species, and a real increase in the number of species involved. And more importantly, we've seen a real increase in the involvement of organized crime in the wildlife trade in the region. And as most of you know, when you think wildlife trade, people think elephants, rhinos, tigers, kind of big sexy things that the media like and that people use as flagships. The reality is the vast majority of the wildlife trade goes unnoticed. Very few people have any idea of the scale, of any idea of the species that are involved, even less so. We know nothing really for most species of the impact trade is having on these wild populations. Trade in this region is largely traditionally for use in traditional medicines and for meat. And Southeast Asia has for a long time been seen as a source of wildlife. But what we're seeing now increasingly is a huge switch. Southeast Asia is one of the biggest consumers of wildlife from outside of the region, and we're seeing a real increase in the pet trade. The majority of species involved in wildlife trade are sold for pets, and we're seeing a big increase in the trophy and luxury trade. Helmeted hornbill casks, different reptile skins, ivory, of course, and on and on. So sadly, the list of species is getting longer and longer every day that we need to be paying attention to, but really people are still focusing on a handful, and they're just slipping through the cracks. We're losing tons of species. Maybe just one more quick point before we move on is people don't realize the scale of the trade. For example, and I'm not picking on any one country, but just for example, last year Indonesia exported 4.6 million reptiles declared as captive bred for the pet trade in Europe and North America. And I think it's really important that people, it's easy to point a finger at China as the great vacuum cleaner in the north, but really there's huge consumers, bodies in other parts of the world. The EU and North America are massive consumers of wildlife in this region, and there really isn't a lot of work being done on that dynamic.
It's a great point, Chris. In my work on wildlife, and specifically ornamental orchid trade, when I started working on it, everyone's comments were, oh yes, well the Japanese and the North Americans are a huge market. And in fact, from my limited insights, these are not the markets of concern. The markets of concern are places like Thailand and Malaysia. And so I think we need to be a little bit more critical in our assumptions and reevaluate. To that end, you spend a lot of time, more than most of us, in the field with the Wildlife Crimes Unit, out investigating and helping to gather evidence for the prosecutions of wildlife traffickers and poachers. And I'm curious to hear from you a little bit about any of the emerging trends that you're seeing in your work in Indonesia from the ground up.
Okay, thank you. So I'm working for wildlife trafficking since 2003, and actually we are focusing on some key species like tiger, rhino, elephants, and also some primates and reptiles. So since 2003, actually the trend of tiger, actually in Indonesia, most of the tiger parks they use it for like stuffed tiger or tiger rug for the wealthy people in Indonesia. And then they just keep the tiger bones because the price of tiger bones in Indonesia not really high because there's no a lot of people use tiger bone as a TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, and also like tiger fangs or even like tiger skull. The price is not really high compared to tiger skin. But after 2010, and then the price of tiger fang increased, and also the bone increased because the demand of that products increased from other countries. So that's why the last price, for example, the last price of the tiger skin in North Sumatra around $8,000 US. Yeah, and also one tiger fang in Jakarta price $3,200 US. So the price is so high compared to maybe less than 2010. And it's quite similar with pangolin, frozen pangolins. So you know that Indonesia is the source of pangolins from some countries like Vietnam and China. So right now, the local people, they say that if you found pangolin, it means that you found gold. I mean that the price is more, even like higher than gold. So right now, actually, there is some demand of, for example, like Chris mentioned about the helmeted hornbill cast, also very high. Price of 1 gram of helmeted hornbill cast price around $150 US. So one helmeted hornbill cast means more than $1,500 US in the local price. So I can say that for some species like tiger or pipe elephant tusk or rhino horn, the trend of the trade is quite, always there since less than 2000. But and then the price and also the trend of some new species increased in 2010 to right now. For example, like we assist the government to raise 3 Borneo earless lizard. So a lot of Germany, they love this reptile. And the government also stated that this species also put on the animal protection regulations. So that's why we push to the government to always follow the trend of the wildlife trafficking in international level. So it doesn't mean that they must just focus on the key species, but also some other animals that the trend of the trade in international market increase. So that's the situation in Indonesia right now.
Could you tell us a little bit also then in your specific work? I mean, because what you're describing is a trend of trade affecting a broader range of species and also changing prices. But there's another trend which you and the Wildlife Crimes Unit has been specifically involved in, and that's of prosecutions. So not only negative trends, perhaps some positive trends. Could you speak just briefly a little bit about that?
Yeah, we find loopholes in the prosecution in Indonesia. So, for example, like almost 100% of the illegal wildlife owners or keepers, the government just confiscate the animals, not try to prosecute or sentence the owner of keepers. Means that we afraid that it's not really reduce the trend of someone keeping the protected animals. But if we see the sentence for the traders or the smugglers, more than 90% of the offenders prosecuted by the judges. So that's why we try to support government, not only try to prosecute the traders or smugglers, but also the illegal keepers, because they are the biggest demand for live animal, for example, like birds or any mammals. So and also if you see the level of sentence, so the government actually they established the regulation mentioned about the maximum 5 years penalty, prison, and also maximum $10,000 US fines. But so far, less than 5% of all the sentence reach 5 years, and also $10,000 US. We calculate the hundreds of the cases, and the average sentence at least less than 2.5 years. So that's why we try to increase the knowledge of the judges and prosecutors, try to make them understand about the threat of animals, so they will increase the charge and also increase the sentence to create the deterrent effects. Also try to address the illegal keepers, because they are also the very important market for the traders, especially like animals.
Legal innovations, as you're describing, definitely represent one important avenue for considering solutions to illegal wildlife trade. And I'm wondering, Rebecca, in your background, your experience in law, what kinds of legal innovations and what kinds of perhaps loopholes do we need to be aware of when we're thinking about how the law can be used as one of our interventions?
Right, morning everyone. Just a little background about myself. I wrote my PhD thesis on the tiger parts trade, and I'm based in Hong Kong. And I spent a lot of time traveling across China trying to find criminal groups that supply these protected animal products. So in terms of prosecution and enforcement of the relevant law, I think two main issues that we really have to address is, firstly, not just in Hong Kong, but across many regions in the world, the courts are not equipped with the training and the knowledge of prosecuting these crimes. So I'll give you an example, is there was a case in Hong Kong just a couple of years back. It was one of the very few cases that was actually reported, but it only went all the way to the magistrate because the maximum imprisonment is 2 years. There was a tourist that was smuggling rhino horn back and forth China, and she was a repeated offender. And when she went to court, she pleaded guilty, and I think she had about less than 2 months sentence, but she was trafficking in rhino horns that has a value of nearly $500,000 Hong Kong dollars. So this is one of the examples to illustrate to you that sometimes when the judge has to make a decision, they're not necessarily equipped with the information, the value, and how endangered some of these species are. The second observation is in China, where a lot of protected animals and CITES protected species are being consumed and exploited. There is a disparity between the Chinese national law, so protected species come under wildlife protection law that was enacted in 1989. So basically they have categories of Chinese protected wildlife, but that list has not been updated since 1989. And what is a very worrying sign is that list do not correspond with the CITES protected animal list. So many times when I'm in the field and I'm talking to these criminal groups that are supplying these animals, they know they're doing something wrong, they know they're offending the law, they're offenders, but they do not know the punishment, and they do not know the species they're dealing with. Another observation is that some of the species that, just to back up on Chris's point, some of the species which we pay a lot of attention to, so for example, the ivory and tigers and rhino, in many sense more, if I may say, more fortunate than many other species in the world that are being exploited. So one very good example is the yellow-breasted buttons. It's a small bird with yellow fur on its chest. And it's not protected under CITES. It's only protected in 2 regions in China. And according to IUCN Red List, the population has gone down by about 60% in the past decade. And that's because they're being eaten in China and literally being eaten to extinction. So there's a pressing threat to also look at species that are not protected in some of these nations where wildlife are being exploited.
Thanks, Rebecca. And of course, much of our focus when we're talking about wildlife trade is indeed on enforcement, specifically of harvesters and intermediaries. I personally believe it's a really important strategy. It's in our toolkit. But I sense that sometimes we're over-focusing on enforcement of the harvesters, at risk of overlooking some of the other strategies that we can use to curtail, not over-focus, I exaggerate. We're under-focusing on enforcement. But there are still other strategies that perhaps we've underutilized, and one of those is engagement of the private sector. And yesterday we were discussing just how important it is to engage the private sector when it comes to industrial agriculture. And I think solutions to wildlife trade are perhaps no exception. And Clifford, I'm hoping that from the industry perspective, you can speak to us a little bit about your role and what kind of innovations are coming from the TCM industry itself.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. I just want to share with you some experiences. I've been with the company for about 20 years. I've seen how the TCM industry has evolved during that time. So when I first joined the industry, CITES had, Singapore had just been a signatory of CITES not too long, and I would say nothing much changed when you become a signatory. The trade continues, and And it was only about a few years after that, about, I think about 10 years ago, there's an organization called ACRES, which I think Chris is aware of it, and some of you may probably know about this. They came alongside the industry to initiate a campaign to basically educate the public and the industry on in those days it was called trade in endangered species. So I think it's relates to the same thing as what we're talking about today. So we had they came out with a scheme which was basically a very simple labeling scheme to get basically pledges from TCM industry shops who would put up this label in their stores. And basically this label says that they don't sell any endangered species in that store. That helped to really, educate the public, so public were able to differentiate between shops who had these posters up and those that didn't. As a result of this interest, the awareness was increased and people started talking about it. And I think surveys were done after that to show that the trade of this through the TCM shops had actually declined quite dramatically. The other example I can share with you is really government support. We have cases where when scientists came in, there were the more unscrupulous traders who continued to sell things like bear parts and tiger bone. But are they genuine? That's a big question mark. And a lot of them sort of say, well, we like to sell it, but if they get caught, they say, well, I'm not really selling this stuff. It's not really genuine. And so in Singapore, there's an act that it's called the Endangered Species Act. That was implemented. What it says is that you cannot advertise the sale of any bear parts at all. It's not allowed. It doesn't depend. It's regardless of whether the bear part is genuine or not. You're just not allowed to advertise. So things like this help to curb the trade of this in our industry.
I'm going to push a bit further if I can. I mean, there is a lot of finger pointing at the TCM industry, specifically when it comes to wildlife trade. Chris has talked about other drivers of trade, but I think TCM still, for many taxa, is squarely in our sights. And I'm wondering, are we being unfair? What's the differentiation in the market, the TCM market here in Singapore, but also across the region?
Yeah, I think the first thing has to do with the regulators. They've got to decide whether the endangered species are allowed to be used in the formulation. For example, the TCM products in this region, they all require registration from health authorities. And if the health authorities disallow the use of a particular animal part, then nobody is allowed to use it. That's the industry that we're in. There is another sort of area of the industry which is to do with the unregistered, unregulated items. That's a bit difficult to control because I think in the past, because the TCM industry had the widespread use of these substances in their products, and as they're removed, people still think, oh, I can still find these things from the shops, unless there's education, there's public education for the industry, and also for people realize that this is not right, this is no longer legal, it's banned, and for the industry to find substitutes, which is what's happening with in certain areas. I think it's perhaps not enough education. And thirdly, I think there is things like endangered species is no longer, how should I call it, culturally acceptable these days. The younger generation of consumers will not take to this. It's a little bit like shark's fin. So we're seeing a move away from this. So it's a combination of different factors.
Chris, is this the same picture that you're seeing?
I think Singapore really is a leader in this field, and it's an example that we use when we're working in other countries. Malaysia, for traditional medicines, is still lagging far behind Singapore. We've done surveys of traditional Chinese medicine shops throughout Malaysia and found bear bile, for example, openly available in the vast majority of the shops surveyed. Not all of them, but the vast majority, which is against the health codes in the country. It's against the wildlife regulations in the country. But also, very importantly, the majority of that bear bile for sale in Malaysia is imported illegally from China. It's from either from bear farms in China or from other sources, but it's coming in with packaging. It's manufactured in China, so it's a violation of CITES as well. So the campaign that was jointly run between the industry and acres is something we'd like to see happen in other countries, because it really is a success story. But again, throughout the region, we have a lot of variance in where we are in progress-wise. Singapore really is a leader on that front.
And in Hong Kong, what kinds of observations do you have there in terms of kind of industry engagement with this shift that Clifford's describing here in Singapore in the TCM community?
I think in Hong Kong, the general observation is if you go into when I was doing fieldwork in Hong Kong or in China, if you go into a shop that is selling legitimately TCM, and you ask for a product such as parts of the tiger or parts of rhino horn, they would. I've been educated on the law on this. They actually told me it's not good to be buying these products. The responses are quite a mixture. I've also been told to go look on the internet and don't come back to the shop because I'll get them in trouble. But what is actually worrying is the legal industry is doing a lot, and the government is helping a lot in conserving these species. But for me, in my work, and what is perhaps more pressing and urgent is there is always a legal market for any sorts of TCM, especially in mainland China. So here I can just share with you an example of the use of TCM in everyday's life in the Chinese community. One of my friends has, he confessed it to me that he used rhino horn when he was very young. So he didn't dare to tell me this because he thought he's going to make me very angry. So when we got to know each other very well, he told me that when he was young, he had a spot on his face that was white, and it just kept growing. So the parents were very worried, and the parents took him to a hospital and clinics across China, but they couldn't cure it. And what was even more worrying is that the spot actually moved around his body. So one day it was on the face, the next day it was on the chest or on his leg. So what happened is the grandmother eventually went out to an illegal shop owner, and he brought 100 grams of rhino horn. And this is about some 20 years ago when he was still living in China. So he actually told me that he applied the rhino horn to the spot, and a couple of months later it disappeared. And my question to him is, if something happens again to perhaps his son or his daughter, is he willing to do the same thing? And he said yes, because it worked on him. So what is worrying is that you have these, so I know it's a bit off topic, but it's just relevant to practice of TCM in China and Hong Kong. What is very worrying is that a lot of these users, they would trust these products to be effective when it's scientifically proven to be not. And because news travel by word of mouth, and other people in his social circle and in his network will believe in it and subsequently demand for such products. And if it's not on sale in the legitimate shops, they would go to the illegal market. And that is something I think is very worrying at the moment.
Louis, in your work in Indonesia, I'm curious, to what extent, Clifford mentioned earlier this idea of we need to find substitutes for certain TCM products. And I'm wondering in Indonesia, I've read recently, including in Manga Bay, about a concern of substitution in wildlife trade for a range of products, not necessarily TCM, but specifically reporting suggesting that there is some substitution happening in the market. Certain products are either not available, either because they're not available, the populations have been extirpated, or extinct, largely extinct across parts of their range, or because the legal conditions have made it impossible to acquire those products. And there's been suggestions that actually the market is providing substitution in that respect. I'm curious what you've seen in the field.
Yeah, thank you. So, actually, the substitution issue is not really a big issue in Indonesia. I mean, how to say? So, the people still believe that using substitute for, well, like product or even like animals is not really useful. So, I mean that they still believe that even like some of the species, for example, like deer antlers. So they believe that if we use wild deer antler, it will be more give benefit for our body compared to like if we be using like breeding deer, something like that. So, and we have survey for TCM shops in Jakarta, in one area in Glodok, and also in South Sumatra province. And they still, the traders and also the consumers still believe that using wild animals, and also not use a substitute for those animals, will be more give benefit for them. So that's why the government is not really put this issue on this substitute issue. But actually, for example, like helmeted hornbill cast in Kalimantan. So traditional people, tribals, actually they just use the kill helmeted hornbill or other hornbills for meats, not for the cast. And then the market, they see the opportunity and then they try to buy cast from the local peoples. And also in some ceremonies in Kalimantan, for example, they also use like helmet hornbill feathers. And then some of the NGO, they try to educate them and using substitute for the hornbill feather, but it's not really effective because you know that the local people believe that using original animal, wild animal, will be more how to say give the benefits compared to using substitute. Yeah.
So what's the sense, Chris, and what has been traffic's experience around this issue, which we're discussing, which is effectively of behavioral change, specifically among consumers?
Yeah, I think behavioral change work is something that needs to go hand in hand with the other, with enforcement. I don't think any of these paths are going to lead anywhere on their own. I think we have to be working on enforcement, on behavior change, working with the industry, all of these things in parallel. Behavior change for consumers is a big one. Looking at alternatives or substitutes to things like bear bile. There's more than 50 herbal substitutes to bear bile, for example. But also we're looking at wild versus captive bred issues where people are often using the captive bred industry, if you want to, captive breeding industry as a substitute to wild populations. And while we see a huge need for substituting, for looking for substitutes for threatened species that are in trade, we also see a huge risk in how this is opening doors for new illegal avenues of trade. So it's absolutely essential we find substitutes. I hope I'm making sense here. But at the same time, not threatening more species. Side out as an alternative to rhino or something like this that just puts another species at threat, and not opening avenues for more smuggling.
Forgive my ignorance, Clifford, but from the practitioner community, TCM practitioner community, how transferable? What is the substitutability across taxa? And what's the potential for substituting herbals for bear bile, or one taxa for another? How flexible is the pharmacopoeia?
Right. I was about to address this issue. So what we see now is that the traditional pharmacopoeia is becoming out of date for a number of reasons. Some of those ingredients in the pharmacopoeia, there's not enough science conducted on those ingredients. I'm talking about animal parts. Even if you can, okay, so one is science. Even if you can do the science, it is very hard to standardize an animal part, unlike botanicals. Botanicals you can standardize, animal parts you can't. So if you want a modern day TCM, you've got to have a standardized production, batch by batch. And you can't add an animal part in and expect this to happen. It doesn't happen. So that's on the production side. Then there's on the scientific side, with how much difference does an animal part make to a formula. In some cases, it doesn't make a lot, in which case it's better to remove it. In other cases, there is some, and this is where we talk about some, replacing with something else. So we see that the pharmacopoeia is also changing. It is also becoming, they have to stay relevant, let's say, to the modern society. So we see the shift between the old pharmacopoeia and the new pharmacopoeia. So the new pharmacopoeia, tiger bone is removed completely, and that's been there for a long time, because when China banned the use of tiger bone in TCM way back in '93, they also removed it completely from the pharmacopoeia. This is still something that we see. Secondly, is that as I mentioned before, it's the cultural issue. It's very hard to have ingredients in a formula where it's no longer culturally relevant. It becomes people are put off by it, for example. This is on the TCM side, but I also see, this is to Dwee's point, a resurgence of the rising middle class income. People with a bit of money, and they want to spend it on ornamental items, so they buy this as pets. Sorry, I want to come back to a point about TCM, and that is the difference between belief systems. So, because it's been around in the industry so long, and even though it's no longer relevant, no longer beneficial, or it's not it should not be used, people have a belief that, they have to stick to this. And this is a little bit to also Dwee's point. And it's very hard to change that belief system. Even though you raise it completely from pharmacopoeia, it's not on the market. And as what Rebecca said, they'll still look for the legal traders, the underground traders. So these are some of the challenges that we face.
So we've been talking around the issue of behavioral change, and I think we can all think from our own lives how ingrained some of our own beliefs are, and how difficult those are to shift voluntarily. What if that shift isn't voluntary? What if that shift is mandated and enforced? The strategy that we use when we've decided that an act is illegal, of poaching or of illegal trade, it's not behavioral change through education campaigns or charismatic adverts. It's hard-nosed enforcement. Should we, and are we, using hard-nosed enforcement against consumers of illegal wildlife? My sense is that we've been targeting them with education. Why aren't we targeting them with the same type of approaches that we're targeting other parts of the value chain? Any insights, Rebecca?
I think if we were to discuss, in a sense, who's responsible or who should bear the biggest responsibility in the illegal wildlife part trade, then we come into this debate of So at the very beginning, the animal was poached illegally from the habitat, and then subsequently a middleman would smuggle it into the destination country and then distribute it to its consumers. So then you come to the question of, if you look at these, some of the profile of these poachers, they are actually motivated by money. It's the biggest incentive for them to catch a pangolin. So for example, as you say, it's gold that is walking across their backyard, and they catch it. They know there's a demand, and then they sell it to to the middleman, subsequently distributed. And then on the other hand, if you look at the profile of these buyers, because this would also link into behavioral change, many of these wildlife products are not scientifically proven to be effective in improving humans' health, but they are bought because it's a status symbol. So in a sense, if you look at the price tag of an ivory or pangolin or tiger skins, unless you have the money and also the status to get your hands on these products in the illegal market and yet not be enforced, then you will never be able to buy one of these products. You cannot just walk into a shop and ask for a tiger skin. It doesn't happen this way. So you come to the question of, are you going to prosecute the buyer, where obviously he or she has a much higher social status than the poacher at the beginning stage of poaching the animal? Just referring back to my example of the rhino horn user, the friend of mine who actually used rhino horn, he is very, very highly educated and he's a professional. So do we enforce him, or do we prosecute the person that sold the grandmother the rhino horn powder? So that's the first question. And I think that the second point that I really want to drive home today is, if we're pointing fingers at who is responsible, I think to a certain degree and to a different extent, I think we're all responsible for this trade. In many ways, I try to deliver this message when I'm teaching my students in university, when I'm giving public lectures, when I'm based in Hong Kong, in the sense that if we start pointing fingers at any stakeholders or any stage of the distribution chain, we can have tougher enforcement, but criminals are very smart. They will always outsmart the law. And there's always some kind of corruption in this trade, very unfortunately. So in the sense that we're all responsible in our own capacity to inspire other people to be concerned for this trade. And one of the questions that I usually conclude my lectures on is, if we forget, as an academic, I often fall into the trap of using a lot of academic concept and theory, but I think it just comes down to a very simple fact that we have so much technology and material possession, and we to travel the world, to develop our life, to make our life more convenient, more easy. If we can all just share a small part of that responsibility and the technology and our knowledge, and to protect the vulnerable species, that because of our personal indulgence we're driving to extinction. I think that if everyone, I know it's speaking in very idealistic terms, but if every one of us can realize that, I'm very hopeful that the trade would be significantly reduced.
I appreciate, no, I'm not done with you. I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm curious from a legal perspective, and specifically from Chinese law. Should we be prosecuting consumers of endangered species? And can we?
Yes. So strictly legal sense in mainland China, there was in 2014, the National People's Congress actually handed down a new interpretation of the criminal code. And it basically said if you are caught eating state-protected animals, for example, pangolins or the musk deer, then you are facing 10 years in prison. Yet on the other hand, if you are illegally hunting species and wildlife that is protected by the state, you're looking at 5 years. So yes, in the legal sense, they are putting a much heavier punishment on the demand side.
And has this been used? And what's your perspective in terms of its potential deterrence effect?
After this law has been interpreted, I've actually I spent a lot of time in China, and one of my projects is actually looking at consumers that consume these state-protected species. Because perhaps going back to the point why I say criminals are very smart, because if you serve a pangolin, you never know it's a pangolin. It could taste just like chicken. So one of my interviewees actually had eaten a owl, and he described that it tastes just like chicken. So these guys are smart. They know it's very expensive, and they can cheat you at the supply chain. But going back to the question is whether there has been a change. The previous time I walked into a restaurant that serves state protected species, I still saw a lot of consumers eating state protected species. So the law is there. The media attention and promotion is also there, because you now see posters around the tube station in China promoting these messages, but the enforcement is not consistent.
How about in Indonesia? Who in your projects? Who are you going after? Are these harvesters? Are these intermediaries? Or are these end consumers that you're looking at for prosecution?
So actually, more than 90% of criminal in Malaysia, they are organized criminal groups. I mean that they come from various ethnics, various families, not organized crime, because it's different between organized criminal group and organized crime. So that's why the intervention for organized criminal group means we must prosecute all of the level of the criminal, from poachers to the middlemen, also owners. So that's why we promote that the government should not choose the criminal, should not choose only middlemen or traders, but also the owners, because it will dismantle all of the structure. So it's quite different with organized crime, which is we can just arrest the top of the family, then dismantle the structure. So that's why since 2003, actually, we tried to push the government, and then right now we have more than 350 cases, but still a lot of the cases come from traders and middlemen. So and also we try to increase the number of sentences. So, but in terms of some species, for example, like pangolins or tiger bones, and also seahorses, for example, there's a lot of demand from outside, not from Indonesia. So that's why we try to strengthen the exit point using with the government, with the customs, and also with quarantine, and also try to try to increase the livelihood in the local people, for not to poach the pangolin or tigers, but also using other benefit with their local livelihood, something like that.
What kinds of penalties are you seeing? And again, specifically for consumers or for owners of illegal wildlife?
So actually, owners, traders, and middlemen, they will impose with the same penalty, 5 years maximum, and also $10,000 fines. But the reality is, the owners, they just the government just confiscate the animal, like animals, but not to sentence them. But the traders and the middlemen, more than 90%, they prosecute. Even like just less than 2.5 years in the jail and less than $5,000 fines. So the sentence is not really high. So that's why we try to increase the government tried to change the regulations. They will establish minimum penalty just to make sure that the prosecutor and judges will start with the minimum penalty. So this which is a good result for us. So the prosecutor not prosecute the sentence with less than 1 year, for example. But we still try to push the sentence to the maximum to create deterrent effects.
What's your perspective, Chris? More charismatic posters of endangered wildlife, or more sentencing of consumers?
Well, both. I think we need more awareness raising, but we definitely need to be seeing laws being used more effectively. I think, if I can touch on the point earlier, that consumers definitely need to be prosecuted. They're the reason people are trading wildlife. If there's no risk to a consumer, then the demand is going to continue. And we're seeing species disappear because people want to buy them. And if people didn't want to buy them, there'd be no incentive for people to be risking smuggling from across continents. There'd be no incentive for poachers to go out and spend time and effort getting a species that no one's going to buy at the end of the day. Sure, there's always going to be some market. I'm simplifying things, and I'll simplify things even more right now. If Jacob started up a little popcorn business right here intending to sell popcorn to all of you, and none of you bought popcorn, Jacob would be a fool to continue with his little popcorn business. I'm really simplifying things here. But it's clearly the consumers need to be part of the equation, and if there's not a disincentive in place for consumers to be buying species, you know, consumers are the reason we're losing the tortoises from Madagascar, consumers in this region. Consumers in this region are the reason we're losing a multitude of songbirds. Consumers in China are the reason we're losing helmeted hornbills. It's not because smugglers have found a helmeted hornbill and right away there was and they created demand. Consumers are driving the demand, so there definitely has to be awareness raising and strong enforcement. Every time I give a talk to a European or North American audience and I tell them that they're the biggest buyers of threatened reptiles from Southeast Asia, there's widespread shock. Nobody is aware that Europe and North America are driving the demand in Southeast Asian pet reptiles. So there's room for awareness clearly as well.
You know, it's difficult because we're mixing metaphors. We're talking about substitution in different contexts, but we're also talking about hugely different geographies. We're talking about a multitude of species with different life histories and really fundamentally different market patterns. And so it's I really struggle with discussions about illegal wildlife trade because we're talking about so many different things. Now I accept that for helmeted hornbills and so on, that the potential for sustainable harvest or the potential for farming, you know, if the market wants it, this probably isn't one of the tacks that we should be looking at. But there are a lot of wildlife that the market demands that we have the capacity to raise in captivity. Tigers are cats. They breed well. And I'm curious, you know, we've been talking about behavioral change among consumers. We've talked a little bit about enforcement along different points of the value chain. But at some point, as Rebecca was saying, if the criminals are so creative and so resourceful, and if the market is going to continue to demand it, for the taxa where we can farm these species, Clifford, why don't we? If the market wants it, and if the market wants tiger bone and we can farm tigers, why don't we do that instead of knocking our heads against ingrained cultural beliefs and fundamentally difficult enforcement?
Yeah. That's a good point. I think there are steps to farm some of these animals. There's nothing stopping, for example, the industry from using farmed animals. I think what we're talking here in the illegal wildlife is there's a consumer preference for wild animals rather than farmed animals. There's a belief that farm animals are not as robust, which in a way is true scientifically. The diversity is not there, so and that's to do with things that they consume. But I think for things that they wear ornamental, it's really status symbol. Mine's wild versus farm, right? So as far as the industry is concerned, there's nothing stopping farming of animals from taking place. Sometimes it doesn't work. Example I give you is deer musk. Deer musk it comes from a gland, the male musk deer. It's been used in TCM for medicines basically. But it's obviously not sustainable because you've got to kill the musk deer before you can extract the glands. So about 20, 30 years ago, the Chinese government had a project to come up with artificial, synthetic deer musk, which they did. It was a top secret project. And basically overnight, they instituted everybody who had deer musk in their product to replace it with synthetic deer musk, which they had planned beforehand. There was only one selling agency for this synthetic deer musk. And all the manufacturers had to do this basically overnight. And the selling agency controls the use of this down to, I would say, the last gram. So you come up, they give an allocation at the beginning of the year, and then you've got to demonstrate that you've used every gram of that product, every gram of the ingredient for your product, and not any more. So this is a way of curbing the use of natural deer musk for the industry.
So that's synthetic. I'm curious, Rebecca, from your knowledge of trade networks, specifically around tiger bone and other parts, what scope do you see and what links do you see between wild trade and this idea of possibly captive breeding some of these species, including tigers?
I think if we have, if we propose this idea of a sustainable farming and trading of captive animals, there's many arguments to support this idea, but personally I will take the stance that it is very difficult to enforce. So I'll illustrate with not tigers but ivory. The big debate about ivory trade is, for example, in Hong Kong where I'm based, any ivory that comes into Hong Kong before the 1989 ban is legal to be sold in the market as long as you register it with the government and you have a license. But anything that came into Hong Kong after 1989, after the ban, everything is illegal. But in the sense that unless you have the technique to test the age of the ivory, you don't know when it came from. So there is evidence to show that the illegal trade is covered by the legal trade. So in a sense, if you apply this logic to farming animals and to wild tigers, how do we know if it's farm or if it's wild? We go into a shop and I ask for a tiger bone. How can we tell this one is farm and this one is wild? And also, as Clifford pointed out, wild tigers or wild animals is always much more perceived to be more effective, to be on higher demand. So in a sense, you're offering them a legal alternative to something that is illegal. So what happens is people, criminals, acting out of incentive to make a profit, they will still be poaching. They will still be poaching wild animals legally to maximize the profit. So I think it's a very the enforcement and the inspection and monitoring is something that is very difficult to enforce.
Chris, would you like to weigh in on this? I know that you've done some work on this idea of captive breeding.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, to be very clear, there's two kinds of captive breeding: commercial captive breeding and conservation breeding. And people often mix this up. Conservation breeding is when a species is being wiped out in the wild, they're removed from the wild, they're bred with the purpose of ensuring they don't go extinct and reintroduced eventually, hopefully. So let's put that aside. I'm fine with that. Commercial captive breeding, when I first started working in this region, I thought was kind of a good idea. Maybe had a lot of potential, maybe could supply demand, maybe would even alleviate pressure off of wild populations. Over a couple of decades of research, I've come to really absolutely hate this concept. It's become my worst nightmare. It's one of our main projects is we're looking at large-scale laundering of wild-caught animals declared as captive bred. And when I say large-scale, I mean some countries annually are exporting more than 4 million animals declared as captive bred. There's probably a few biologists in the room, but it doesn't matter. Breeding 4 million animals in a year is fairly difficult. Impossible. So if you were breeding guppies or goldfish or white mice, I might believe you. So one of our biggest challenges is countries like the US, for example, has a real struggle in preventing this laundering because their legislation, the onus is on the authorities to prove that the animals are not captive bred. They arrive with permits saying that they are captive bred, and it's very difficult to prove they're not. So we need to see these systems change because if you were to actually legally captive breed reptiles, for example, in Southeast Asia, you'd go broke because economically speaking, for most species, it doesn't make sense. Your competitors are all doing it illegally. They're all laundering, so you're going to lose out to the competition anyway. Your profit margins are just going to be ridiculous. ridiculous. We did a study on tokay geckos. 3 million tokay geckos exported from one country in the region declared as captive bred in 1 year from 3 dealers. 3 million captive bred tokay geckos. Imagine you had 0 mortality rate of parent stock. Imagine all of your tokay geckos bred to maximum capacity. Imagine you had 100% hatching success and no juvenile mortality. Imagine your tokay geckos were happy to breed in the smallest cages that they're recorded to breed in, which is 30 centimeters cubed. Let's imagine they're all happy to do it in a little cage like that. You would need a pile of cages 2 meters tall and 69 kilometers long. You would need 250 people to feed the millions of crickets 24 hours a day needed to keep your breeding stock alive. And you'd need to be able to retail them for more than 15 or 10 euro each. Or you can buy them for 15 cents from the wild and get permits that say they're captive bred. It's just turned into a huge laundering industry with millions of species, some that could be captive bred, some that maybe not. Pangolins, for example, anyone who's worked with pangolins know that commercially breeding pangolins is pretty far-fetched. If you put a pangolin in a cage today, tomorrow you either have a big hole in the cage or a dead pangolin. They're not chickens, they're not cows. So I could talk all day on this, I won't though, but it really is a huge loophole that's being abused by importers and being abused by exporters to move a multitude of threatened species into the international market and legalizing it. There's also a messaging problem. When things are captive bred or declared as captive bred, people think it's okay to buy them. There's no harm in buying these reptiles. They must be captive bred, it must be good, I'm probably helping conservation by buying this captive bred animal. So there's some problems there. There's also a messaging problem that people, if the governments are allowing captive breeding, then for whatever purpose the species being bred for, it must be good. The government is giving it the green light. It must work to cure ailments. It must be part of a conservation system, whatever. And actually, in some cases, actually increases demand. So there's been studies done on bear farming, for example, where promoting farmed bears is actually increasing pressure on wild bears because the demand is going up. Laundering, as was mentioned, is going up. It's very difficult for authorities to step into a place and say, well, look at an animal and determine whether it's from the wild or captive bred. Sometimes they're missing legs and it kind of helps you determine that possibly there was a snare in this bear's life at some point. It's not always that easy. So it's commercial captive breeding is a huge conservation risk, in my opinion.
Well, fortunately, we've got a symposium on this later this morning. We'll be talking about it because, again, huge range of taxa, and maybe the realities that you're describing are certain countries or certain taxa, but situations may be different elsewhere, or maybe that's across the board. I'd like to shift the talk a little bit towards a little bit more forward-facing. We obviously have a problem. We obviously have a situation where, whether it's enforcement or substitution, synthetic or farming, whether it's enforcement at any point along the value chain or voluntary behavioral change, we've got a lot of challenges. I'm going to put you in a hard spot and ask you, what do you see as the emerging needs from conservationists, but also from conservation researchers? Where should we be focusing our efforts in your perspective?
Okay, law enforcement will be the best intervention for reducing or dismantling the criminal networks. And second, also the criminal are now very clever to avoid the prosecution. So, for example, like Indonesia regulation only mention about the Southern tigers as a protected tigers in Indonesia, even like Bengal tiger or Emperor tiger listed on the site subject one, but Indonesian regulations not mention about two species. So that's why some the tiger trader, for example, they arrest by the officers, then they will claim that this came from some Bengal tigers. So that's why the government must prove the tiger skin to make sure that the traders try to trade the tiger skin. So this the point is that the research activity will be more involved on the to tackle the wildlife crime in Indonesia, for example. And And also, we was always got some criticism from the researcher talking about the releasing animal from the confiscation activities. For example, like we helped the government to release more than 100 live pangolins several months ago. And then the researchers community, they talking about the source, the origin of the pangolin. So it's not quite too risky to just to release the pangolins in the wild without knowing the origin of the pangolins. Something that we need to address in the future. And also, we have some collaboration with the quarantine and customs at the border because you know that they lack of knowledge about the species identification, like about the trade routes. So that's why we want to enforce them using scientific base to understand, to make them increase understanding of species identification or the network something. Yeah, and awareness actually will be more effective if this activity followed by law enforcement, because you know that not all people understand and follow the soft intervention, need the hard intervention to make them understand.
So that's, from a practitioner view, I can see that makes sense. Rebecca, you are also coming to this from a law criminology background, but an academic one. And I'm wondering, yeah, again, where should we be focusing our energies? And you know, we're not enforcement experts, we're not criminologists, and yet many of the issues that we've been discussing are fundamentally from that field. So should we leave it to you and go back to counting epiphytes?
Well, as I said earlier, I think every one of us is to a certain degree responsible for spreading the message. But in an academic setting, in the past decade, we've seen increasing scholarship in the field of green criminology. So basically, crimes against the environment. The predominant focus of green criminology is now still on pollution crimes, water pollution, air pollution crimes across the world. But there's an emerging scholarship on looking at crimes against protected wildlife, exploitation and its trade. So coming from an academia background, I would encourage young scholars and students to read more or to learn more about this topic, and also to start really thinking of ways in which we can conduct further research in this area. So in a sense, I'm not encouraging any students to go into the field and start chasing criminals to get interview data. But we can, there's other projects we can work on. So for example, we can look at the perception of some of these buyers of these wildlife products. It doesn't have to be ivory or tigers. You know, recently there's increasing attention on shark fin and its consumers and restaurants in Hong Kong. And now it's been, the prevention of shark fin consumption has been relatively very successful in Hong Kong. So there's different angles in looking at it. And of course there's the legal perspective. For lawyers or lawyers-to-be, I think one of the very important message is to really tell the people in the legal profession of the magnitude and the value of these wildlife products. So in the sense that before you go into, if you are given to prosecute a case of people trading in endangered wildlife, it's just, you'll be surprised at how many people that walks into the courtroom without knowing the value and the extent of threat these species are faced with. So just very simple little things like that I think we can do in order to give the audience a much better rounded picture of the threats we're up against.
Clifford, how can researchers, how can conservationists help the TCM sector?
Well, I think there's some work already starting. I mentioned earlier on how the TCM industry is also evolving. Ingredients or parts that were considered plentiful decades ago, centuries ago, are now being threatened. So the researchers and so on have to come up with either something to replace this in a sustainable manner, or what we're seeing is that in countries that we operate in, the first thing we look at is is our product formulated according to the latest law. It doesn't matter whether consumers feel, oh, you've taken something out, we think it's less effective and so on. Well, the thing is, if you buy this in this country, it's going to be legal, first thing. And if there has to be a bit of compromise with what's in the tradition, what's in the past, so be it. Because if you don't do it, the industry is no longer sustainable. Because the business we're in, TCM is in, it's to do with natural products. If you don't maintain those natural products, you don't have a business in the future. So it's we have to continue to look for substitutes, replacements. In worst cases, we just have to, if there aren't any, we just have to remove it completely.
Chris, would you like to weigh in? Give us any signposts as to places where we should be focusing as conservationists and as researchers? I mean, traffic has been doing this for a long time, and you've got some specific models, market surveys, and so on. Do we need more of this, or are there other things that we should also be looking at?
I think we definitely need to be doing a lot more of the monitoring of the basic research. We need to be looking at the impact trade is having on a wide variety of species and looking for different ways to reduce trade, different ways to reduce the overall threats to these species. There's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to species, as you know. When there's some that think, well, if we address tigers, we'll protect everything that lives near tigers. These models don't work. If we're going to protect tigers, we need to fight really hard to protect tigers. And then the lizard that lives in the same habitat, we're going to have to fight really hard to protect that lizard might be with a completely different toolkit. And in most cases, we don't know what the needed tools are. So we need a lot more market monitoring. We need a lot more research. We need a lot more enforcement. I'm a huge believer in CITES, and I know most people scoff at that and say CITES doesn't work, CITES has failed. That's like saying, blaming a hammer for failing to build a house. The hammer wasn't supposed to build the house. Somebody was supposed to use the hammer to build the house. So CITES, I think, is an incredible tool, loads of potential, but it's not being used effectively, and I think we really need to support better use of CITES. We need to see that CITES becomes an effective conservation tool. It's really all we've got when it comes to international trade. It's the best thing we've got going, so why not make it work? And I think there needs to be a lot more looking, so in addition to enforcement, a lot more research done on how we can change consumer attitudes, how we can change behavior, but we can't do it, and the research by itself is just going to get us a bunch of nice papers about species that are going to go extinct. The enforcement by itself is going to complicate things in a number of ways and make a lot of people angry. And awareness raising by itself or demand reduction by itself isn't going to address the problem. So we have to do all three of these things in tandem. The conservation community, the academic community, we have a tendency to swing from one extreme to the other all the time. Enforcement doesn't work, so let's not do that anymore. Let's do demand reduction and forget enforcement. It failed. We can't do that. We need to be doing all three of these things in tandem and in a much bigger and better way.
Chris, I'd like to ask you one last final question, and a much more local question. We've heard about some, very progressive approaches by portions of the TCM community here in Singapore. But what kinds of wildlife issues, illegal wildlife trade issues, do we still have here in Singapore? And what needs to happen about them in your experience?
You're trying to get me in trouble.
Yeah, that's right. So this is the last time you'll ever see Chris speaking in Singapore.
Singapore still plays a very big role in the global wildlife trade, perhaps nowhere near what it used to be. Singapore used to be a major consumer of ivory, for example. It's not anymore, but it still is a major transit point for ivory. So it still plays a big role as a transit point for ivory, for pangolins, for freshwater turtles, reptile skins, etc. There's still a major problem when it comes to sourcing wildlife to be sold in Singapore or moved through Singapore. So we have huge volumes of birds, for example, huge volumes of birds imported into Singapore and then legally exported from Singapore. Huge volumes. It's one of the biggest transit points for bird trade globally. A lot of these birds are not legally sourced. So however they get to Singapore, let's not focus on that. The problem is when they leave Singapore, it's legal trade. There's legal export. We're talking hundreds of thousands of CITES listed birds. So this is where the authorities in Singapore really need to ramp up due diligence. If there's a chance that the birds that are being sourced for trade in and through Singapore are coming from a legal source, then they shouldn't be permitted. We did a study a few years ago where we found 65,000 parrots and cockatoos coming from the Solomon Islands, with 75% of those going through Singapore, and the vast majority of them being declared as captive bred. There is no breeding facilities in the Solomon Islands. So it was being used as a laundering point and a clearinghouse. African gray parrots right now are under threat like never before, with wild populations being completely depleted, being hammered, and yet Singapore is one of the biggest movers of African gray parrots. And African gray parrots that come out of Singapore are legal. So this doesn't mean there's corruption, it doesn't mean that there's a big shady game going on here. It means that there's not enough effort being put into ensuring due diligence and ensuring that the birds moving through Singapore are not illegally sourced. So really there's a lot that needs to be done on those particular issues here in Singapore.
For those of you who were with us at the SCB meeting in Malacca 2 years ago, you might recall that wildlife trade really wasn't on the agenda there. I don't even really recall if there were many talks on it at all. I'm really pleased that today, not only do we have a panel, but when we set out to come up with a wildlife trade symposium, we ended up with 3. So I hope that you'll not only join me in thanking today's panelists, but join us for part of the rest of today as we talk about a number of different issues affecting wildlife trade and prospective solutions in the region. But again, please join me in thanking our excellent panelists.